the cannery and what led to the cannery, and then POWs, and then what happened after the cannery, the whole history of the property, really. We're going to start off with...
Hey, John, before you start, can I move this back?
You can move
Can
it
you guys
wherever
see
you
it?
want, President.
I think it would be easier. Is that better?
Okay, I'm going to start with a quote. Are we good? Okay. Quote is, history isn't what happened, history is just what historians tell us. And I kind of take that a little serious in that if I'm going to do this presentation, I'm going to make sure that what I tell you is the actual history. So what I did was I went back to original sources. Now we've had things here at the historical site before. We just had a talk 3 years ago on the cannery, and we've got other resources here after the fact. We had an article in the newsletter a while ago, and we've had, Mary Kerr wrote several books on the POWs, but I wanted to go back to original sources just to see if I could find anything new and find some minutia maybe. So that's what I did. I didn't use very much from the secondary sources. But we're going to go back a little bit and kind of see what led to maybe the cannery. So I'm going to go back a little before the cannery. This is a picture of a tavern in Washington from the late 1800s. And at about that time, Washington had about 1,500 residents. And this was on North Main Street over here. And our population at that time was falling. We were smaller than Eureka. And we didn't have a very good reputation. There were 5 saloons on the square. There was some crime, and really our town, you notice it has a dirt road and wood sidewalks, and I kind of picture it as kind of like a town you'd see on Bonanza. And if you zoom out on that picture, well, not on that picture, but a different picture, this was North Main around that same time. And I'm just waiting for Haas and little Joe to ride up. But anyway, that's what Washington looked like in the late 1800s. At that time, saloons, a lot of crime. But I wasn't there. You don't have to take my word for it. There's an article from 1876 of a traveler coming through, and it was a journal. And I had this in my other talk too. And then it was in a newspaper, and he says, "Here we are in Washington with its 5,000 Teutons and 500 lager beer halls. Drink up, drink on, fill up the foaming glass. Gambrinus loves you, and every night he will brew you some good beer." So that was one observer's opinion just coming through town on a train. So things weren't great in the late 1800s. We didn't have a very good reputation. As we went into the 20th century, Washington started to clean things up. The bandstand was added, paving on the square. You can start to see the square look like the square a little bit. And we were trying to portray ourselves a little more, refined, a little more wealthy. Problem was, there were still 5 saloons on the square. And we still had the crime, and it was hard to clean up the town when there was fights, there was public drunkenness, and families were breaking up. And again, I wasn't there, but I have my great-great-aunt's memoirs that she wrote, and she lived in Washington, and she wrote this from around the time in 1904. She said, "Father," who would be my great-great-grandfather, "Father used to walk down to the local pub, have his beer stein filled, and then return home with it. Mother told him that the next time he did it, all of his stuff would be out on the stoop when he returned." Well, it happened. Father went down to the pub, and when he returned, he saw all of his belongings on the front stoop. No one in the family ever saw him again. So, family broke up. They all left Washington. And she goes on to say, "I haven't said much about my father, but I loved him, and he was always good to me. I always enjoyed doing things for him, and when I would iron his stiff bosomed shirt and light vest, he would remark how nicely they were done. After my parents were separated, my father worked around Gardner, Illinois, and he wound up in the county home in Winamac, Indiana, where he died. He had quit drinking and was, as they put it, a good man." So you can kind of see that this was just my family, that it was causing problems with families in Washington. Here's another picture of North Main. You saw that previous picture of North Main. Here's what North Main looked like in the early 1900s. You can see it's much better. Now my great-grandfather, who would have been Mr. Sprunt Stoops' son, there was a little news blurb in 1907 where it says Howard Shepard, that's my great-grandfather, was here Tuesday shaking hands with old friends. He says there are so many improvements since he was last here that he hardly knows the place. So just in a few years, so many changes were being made that it was hardly recognizable to people that had left just a few years prior. Now the big change that happened was there was a local prohibition passed in 1908. So the 5 saloons became 5 restaurants. Now it didn't pass by much, it was a close vote, but what that did was it really helped to clean up the town. And you don't have to take my word for it. This is Alfred G. Heitman, Superintendent of Schools. And what I boxed there, it says, there's no longer the lack of money for school books and clothing. This seems to have been very prevalent before. Children no longer come to school with exciting tales of fights and arrests that they've been witnesses to, and not infrequently to, in their immediate families. That was the superintendent of schools at the time. So after the local prohibition, Washington really wanted to promote itself. Okay, it cleaned up the streets. It was really ready to grow. You can see some headlines there: a location for factories, Washington as a dry town. You know, these are just, in the newspaper, it was over and over. They were publishing these little articles about how great Washington was. And they wanted to grow. And in 1909, the year after the Prohibition, the Commercial Club was formed. And this was the business people in town. And, you know, the first president was Harlan Kingsbury, who was a real estate mogul and a banking mogul in the time. And, you know, they wanted to grow business in Washington. Well, if you grow business in Washington, that helps the real estate people and the banking people. And so they were, you know, kind of trying to help themselves. But it really helped to grow Washington. And they met above what is now the penny store right over here on the south side of the square. You can see a picture of their luxurious room that they met in there. Now, when the Commercial Club formed, it was no secret, and this is a clipping from 1900, that the Dickinson Canning Factory in Eureka was looking to build a second plant. As early as 1900, they were looking for, now that kind of talks about an anonymous canning factory in a neighboring county. It's the Dickinson Canning Factory. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the Dickinson Canning Factory, and then we'll kind of put these two topics together, okay? So Elijah Dickinson was living in Kentucky, and he grew something called a Kentucky field pumpkin. And he brought that with him to Eureka, which was then called Walnut Grove, when he moved to the area in 1835. And he brought seeds with him, and the plant just flourished in the Illinois soil. So Elijah Dickinson, War of 1812 veteran. He was elected to the original Board of Trustees upon the formation of Eureka College in 1850, and he was the president of that Board of Trustees from 1852 until his death in 1862. So he was the one that brought the Kentucky field pumpkin from Kentucky to Illinois. Now, canning in Eureka started with an original canning company called the Eureka Canning Company that had nothing to do with the Dickinsons. It was built in 1895 at a cost of $10,000, and the owners had to borrow another $5,000 to run it. Now, $15,000 in 1895 would be almost $600,000 today. Well, they had a successful crop. They had a successful year, but they got very low prices. So their brand was Eureka College corn, Eureka College tomatoes, and the label had the college on the label. They went bankrupt after a year because they just overshot themselves with getting set up. And so they foreclosed after a year. That cannery closed after 1 year. So 1895 1905 was the only year that cannery existed. So Elijah's son, Roger, bought the cannery in 1898. And this is the beginning of the Dickinson Canning Factory. Okay? So Roger, that's a picture of him right there. He was a Civil War veteran. He was admitted to the bar in 1866, but he always said he'd rather be a good farmer than a bad lawyer. So he never really practiced law. Instrumental in organizing the Eureka schools into the modern school system. He was as a school board member over there for 12 years, and he started the canning factory, like I said, in 1898 with his sons. So, with the commercial club formed here in Washington, the canning factory, the Dickinson Canning Factory, finally decided to come to Washington in 1909, choosing us over Minonk and El Paso. Problem with El Paso was they wanted way too much for their land, and Minonk had sewage issues, some sort of sewage issues that they couldn't solve. The land was purchased in Washington for $150 an acre, for 17 acres from ex-mayor Daniel Chafer over there at the south end of Wood Street. El Paso was asking for $500 an acre. And this was the second canning plant that they lost out on because they were asking too much for the land. Another main issue was that in El Paso, the railroad going through El Paso, which one it was, Illinois Central Railroad, would not guarantee building a switch to the plant. So everything was up in the air in El Paso. Here, the C&A, which was the North-South Railroad going right down Wood Street, for those of you that remember that, they agreed that they could build a switch right off the track to their factory, and the TP&W agreed, and that's what's pictured there. You see where those box cars are, you've got that switch from the TP&W to the, I guess it would have been the C&A at the time. They agreed to let them use that. So they had two railroads, they had a creek behind them, they're 2 blocks from the center of town. They had everything they needed here. Now to tie, why did I start off with all that stuff? Roger's son Richard Dickinson would later say, we would not have located in Washington if it had been a saloon town. As we do not believe that business and booze will succeed together, and the canning season is so short and strenuous that we cannot afford to take chances on our business. So all those decisions that Washington made led to Cannery even coming. So within 2 months of purchase, construction began, and that would have been around November of 1909. And the plan was to kind of build the factory almost identical to the one that the Dickinsons had built in Eureka, not that original picture I showed you, which is kind of like the one that is over there now, it's called the Cannery, and it's an event center. Maybe some of you have been there. Around 50 people were employed to build the cannery, and another 30 were employed to build the railroad switch off to Cannery. Ray Morgan had the contract for the concrete foundation, and Henry Lesh the contract for the buildings. Now here's some of the minutia I found. I've got the dimensions of all the buildings if you care. You can see there that the total cannery was over 50,000 square feet. It had a silo that was 40 feet in diameter, and it had a cement platform along the track that was 250 feet long. The warehouse was 2 stories, and it was 98 by 124. That's where all your empty cans are, your labels, and things like that. So those were the original buildings built. And the plant used 100,000 gallons of water a day. They flooded the floors every day to keep them clean, and all that water drained into farm. Here's kind of a map I found that's actually contemporary to the time. It's not in very good shape, but you can kind of see that meandering line is the creek behind it. And so you can kind of see the powerhouse was north. So this would be the train track going towards, I guess it would be Candlewood Park. And there's the creek. So you got your powerhouse right here. here, your office right here, your warehouse is back here, and then your irrigation bed is on the other side of the creek in that kind of that open area that's still open. So that's kind of the layout. The silo is right there. So that's how it was set up. I don't know what the letters mean. All right, moving on. So the first harvest was in 1910. Doesn't mean they started building in November 1990. Anybody available to work could work. They were asking for 500 people to work in Washington and Eureka. Cost to build the plant was $125,000 to $150,000, which today would be over $5 million. And the first load of corn processed at the Washington Cannery was brought in by Chester Stromberger. A little piece of trivia for you. So 1910, it was very successful. In 1911, Roger Dickinson died. And so it was left to sons Richard and Eugene to take over the business. A few months after Roger died, Eugene died at the age of 33.
Wow.
Yeah. So that left Richard in charge, and later Robert. Robert's the one that moved to Washington. So Richard Dickinson took over. He was the president of the canning factory until 1929. He received the first degree ever granted at U of I in sanitary engineering. He also lettered in track at U of I. Active in the formation of the National Canneries Association and was president. Mayor of Eureka from 1905 to 1911. Chairman of the Eureka College Board of Trustees. Elder in the Eureka Christian Church and director and president of the State Bank of Eureka. So he got around quite a bit. He was kind of a go-getter. Robert, who served later, was the administrator from 1910 to 1960. He's got kind of the same accomplishments here. Director of the First National Bank of Eureka, director of the Eureka Farmers Grain Cooperative, helped establish the golf course over there, and then he was an alderman on city council, and he was the one that moved over to 401 South Main Street in the 1920s, and 401 South Main Street, I'm sure you've seen it, looks like this. The Dickinson Mansion, which was actually built by Herman Danforth around 1906. So, yeah, it's still there. So the Dickinsons were kind of the pencil pushers. You know, they were the ones running the whole conglomerate. But I wanted to talk about the supervisors, or the men that were in charge of the men, that the workers saw on a daily basis. This was more difficult for me, but I did find out some information about the supervisors. The first supervisor at the Washington Cannery was Frank DeMott. And he was actually the supervisor in Eureka. And when the Washington Cannery opened, they moved him over here to take care of the cannery over here. He lasted about 5 years, and he thought he wanted another challenge. So what he did was he bought the city building. And he took over the care of the city building with a man named Guy Wright. And Guy Wright was a man who was a relative of the Dickinsons and had some legal entanglements with them over some inheritance. He was actually a relative of the Dickinsons. So DeMott and Guy Wright take over the Danforth Hotel. You can see an ad right here that says DeMott and Wright, managers of the Hotel Danforth. So in 1914, they take over this hotel. Well, they last only a few months, and they put it up for sale. Frank DeMott would go back to the canning factory business, which is really what he knew, and he would run several different canning factories around the area. The last one he ran was in Brookston, Indiana, when it opened in 1935 until his death in 1943. So just except for those few months running the Danforth Hotel, he ran canning factories for his job for his whole life. The next one to take over here was Ralph DeMott, and his nephew. Ralph he ran it for 2 years, from 1915 to 1917. In 1917, he was hired by the Sears and Roebuck Company in Chicago, and he worked there for decades and worked his way up to general manager, vice president, and he was treasurer of the entire corporation for a long time. Throughout the process of them going from strictly mail order to stores, he was the treasurer throughout that whole process. So he was quite a guy. And for 2 years, he ran Washington Cannery. He was the nephew of Fletcher and Josephine Portman DeMott, and he was the grandson of Joseph Portman, and Portman is a old-time Washington name. The Portmans had a building where Threads Hope and Love now is. It was called Portman Hall, and that was like a part tavern, part hotel, part furniture store over on Zinsser, because Zinsser was much more of a main drag when you had the depot. And people were walking from the depot to the square, and so it was kind of a big thing. This ad that you see is they had opened a skating rink in Portman Hall, and that was Ralph's grandfather's business. So anyway, after Ralph went to Sears, the next person to take over was Frank Blumenschein. And he'd worked at the Washington Cannery since it had opened. He was promoted up to supervisor. He married Ruby Rapp. Ruby's father was Charles. Charles ran a store on the north side of the square. You can see a picture of it there. A touch of homespun is there now. And he remained superintendent for about 8 years, and he was replaced by Guy Wright, the same Guy Wright who bought the Danforth Hotel with Frank DeMott, and the same guy who had all the legal problems with the Dickinsons so many years ago. And Guy Wright ran it until it eventually closed for 20-some years. So those are the guys that kind of had, they were in charge of the men that the men would see on a daily basis. So getting back to the cannery, when it first started, first year or two, there were multiple complaints downstream about the water. That all this water was making the creek foamy, cloudy, stinky, gross. And these complaints were coming from the Danforth Stock Farm, the Burkett Dairy Farm, and the TP&W Dam specifically. So the Danforth Stock Farm there's a map of that entire area was the Danforth Stock Farm, but you can kind of see it's the entire Pine Tree area, it's the Goat Springs area, and they had thousands of animals, and they were using Farm Creek as their water source. The Burkett Dairy Farm was down where the south half of Meadow Valley Park is. I'm pointing at my screen and you can't see what I'm pointing at. This is Meadow Valley Park. This is Dyer's property, if you know where he lives, and this is the sewer down there. This was all the Burkett Dairy Farm. You can see Farm Creek running right through there, used as a water source for the cattle. And then the TP&W Dam is a little bit more of a mystery where that was. My guess is it's just a little bit further west, kind of where the track crosses where the creek widens here. They had a dam, I guess. I don't know what they needed it for, to wash the trains, or the trains needed water. So anyway, they all complained about the water. Eventually it was figured out. I never really figured out how they figured out how to do it. I never saw a solution. There's a picture of something across in the back of the cannery, and you can see the open area behind, some sort of filtration system. I don't know if that was a solution or not. It was just a picture I found, but eventually they figured out and there were no more complaints. So the canneries continues being successful. It employed up to 400 people during the harvest time, but in the off season there was only like 10 to 15 people working there. They could turn out 150,000 cans of corn per day. And during World War I, they were required to supply the Army with 79,000 cases of peas, corn, and pumpkin. Wow. Which they did, and then some of that was returned after the war. And the label for Dickinson's products was Woodford. So you had Woodford corn, Woodford peas, Woodford pumpkin. There you see a few ads of those that I found. Here's another one with a nice little recipe on it, Woodford peas on toast. That sounds delicious. Peas and cream on your toast. One can serves 8. So anyway, that's what the can would have looked like coming out of Dickinson's. In 1918, Dickinson's packaged over 4 million cans of corn during harvest. So here's a couple more pictures I found, probably from the 1920s of the factory. There's that one, and then here's one from the back, from the creek area. So that's in the 1920s. In 1925, the Morton plant was built. So they expanded into Morton. Frank Blumenstein was moved to Morton, and that's when Guy Wright took over in Washington. And in 1929, that's when they were bought out by Libby's. Now, the Dickinson name didn't really change for a few years after that. They keep calling it the Dickinson Cannery or whatever. But Libby's officially bought them out in 1929. But the Woodford brand would continue well into the 40s. As to the reason for the buyout, it kind of depends on who you believe. I've read many different reasons why Dickinson sold to Libby's. One reason I saw was it was the Depression and they needed to sell. Another one was the canning industry was modernizing and Libby's would help them modernize. And then another reason I saw was Libby's wasn't doing that well with pumpkins. And you had the president of the canning industry organization right here, and Dickinson was doing really well with pumpkins, and they had the Kentucky Field pumpkin right here in central Illinois. So Libby's was actually buying them instead of saving them. So whichever, Libby's bought them. And some of you probably know this, but the Kentucky Field pumpkin is a squash. It's not a pumpkin. So that's why on the Dickinson cans and on a lot of the pumpkin cans, it says pumpkin custard, because it's not really pumpkin. As an aside, the story goes that the famous Libby's pumpkin pie recipe was invented right here in Washington. That Hazel Dickinson, which was Robert's wife, played around with different recipes because they needed a pumpkin pie recipe to put on the can. And some of you might know Tish Warren has told the story that she got to try many different recipes, and they eventually settled on the one that it's probably been tinkered with since, but the basic recipe remains to this day that Hazel created. All right, moving forward. Because of World War II, manpower was very short in 1943, and anybody could work. So you had, anybody. A call went out for any able-bodied person to help with the canning effort. And that same year, in 1943, the first German prisoners were sent to Camp Ellis. What is Camp Ellis? Camp Ellis was a gigantic military base between Table Grove and Bernadotte, Illinois, about 60 miles from here, that was opened in the spring of 1943. This huge military base in the middle of nowhere. And German prisoners were sent to there. So in the summer of 1944, they didn't have enough workers for the canning factory, so they came up with an agreement that these German prisoners could come work in the canning factories. Originally, the idea was they'll stay at Eureka College. Well, 2 problems. One, there wasn't enough room at Eureka College. 2, school was going to start. And so you had kind of a double problem there. Here's a picture of the beds in the gym of Eureka College. I assume that summer of 1944, which definitely needed to be moved before basketball season. So eventually all the POWs from Eureka ended up in Washington. They had to put barbed wire around the whole property, and they ended up in the warehouse. It was turned into the barracks for the prisoners. And in the off season, the work did not stop like it had before, because now they were making fruitcakes for the military. So they did that in the off season for the soldiers. Prisoners were paid 10 cents a day and were restricted to working 12 hours per day with Sundays off. They either worked in the factory or they were transported to farms to work, some as far as away as Cannery. The photo on the left is from Mary's Cannery book, which you can see a picture of Mary there holding her book, and that's a picture of some POWs on a farm truck. But Washington was not the only town that POWs were held. Gibson City, Hoopeston, Galesburg, several places in the Chicago area, all kind of had the same situation as Washington when they were holding POWs. Now, there's many accounts in Mary's book, this book. The book we have is Camp Ellis, that's a different book. I don't know if it has the same account. Many accounts of Washingtonians that she interviewed of encounters with the POWs, where most of them are, the POWs would be playing soccer on Sundays down in what now is Candlewood Park, and the kids would go down and watch them play soccer and exchange chocolate through the fence or whatever. And she has a whole bunch of accounts in her book on that. So that was in the summer of '44 is when that started. Here's some more pictures that show the prisoners putting on a play at the Cannery. And then one of the POWs, Alfred Keitzman, painted those two pictures for Father Schubert of St. Pat's and gave them to him. Those paintings are both still hanging in St. Pat's. In fact, I had Mrs. Capron take a picture. That picture was just taken a month ago, hanging up in the classroom. So they're still there. All right, so 1945, in the fall, the war was over. So August 6th, the Hiroshima bomb was dropped, and VJ Day is formally recognized as September 2nd. So September 2nd, 1945 is effectively around the end of the war. But the POWs remained after that for a short time. On September 10th, which is after that, a POW named Reinhold Pavel escaped from Camp Washington. There's a picture of him. There's the news story that came out just a day or two after. I've read in some reports that they tried to keep it quiet, but there were articles about it 2 days after. He was taken prisoner originally in 1943 in Sicily, and he had been in many different camps, ended up in Camp Ellis. He'd been planning an escape for a long time, didn't really come up with the opportunity until Camp Washington. The war was ending, it was over, and the talk was that the Germans were going to be part of a reparation effort in Europe. They were going to be put to work, and he didn't want to do that. He wanted to stay in the United States or whatever. He had saved $15, which today would be about $300. He had some makeshift civilian clothes, and he just crawled under the barbed wire, hitched a ride to Peoria, caught a bus to Chicago, and he was out. Went to Chicago, he opened up a bookstore, and at the same time he's running his bookstore, he's in the papers as wanted by the FBI. All happened at the same time. Here is a little newsreel I found. Let's see if this works.
A prosperous business is the Chicago bookmark, and a modestly prosperous businessman is Reinhold Fable, who until recently was known as Phil Brick, its proprietor. Then the FBI caught up with him as an escaped German prisoner of war. Since 1945, he has established his store, married, and is the father of an 8-month-old baby. He has won the respect of his neighbors and the affection of his son, Christopher. Now he faces deportation. but a Texas attorney whose life he saved in a German prison camp is working on his behalf.
So I don't know about that Texas lawyer. I've never heard anything about that. So, like I said, he married and had a child. He also wrote a book on his experiences, which you can still find on eBay, called Enemies Are Human. It was published in 1955. Like it said, he was captured in 1953. He was sent back to Germany. He tried to get back to the United States. He eventually came back to the United States, but he spent most of the rest of his life in Germany, running a bookstore.
You mean Chicago?
Most of the rest of his life was in
He
Germany.
stayed in Chicago.
The rest of his life?
He was back in Germany with a bookstore. I just didn't clearly.
He was in Chicago when he escaped,
Yeah.
but when he was captured, he went back to Germany.
All right.
So with the end of the 1945 harvest, POWs were sent back to Chicago, and Camp Ellis closed. So it was only open 2 years. This humongous military base in the middle of nowhere. Now, if you go there today, you can still see some remnants of Camp Ellis over there. West Illinois. Now, I did not know where Table Grove and Bernadette were. I had no idea. So I looked it up on a map, and really, if you look up on Google Maps, it looks like Camp Ellis was the entire area between Table Grove and Bernadette. It's got all these little landmarks. Well, this map doesn't tell me where Table Grove and Bernadette are either. So I zoomed out, and I found Macomb here, and Cuba here. So it's literally in the middle of nowhere.
At Bernadette,
Bernadette.
they built the dam that's still there today. If you go there, there's a dam, a little low-level dam, they built that for the
Okay.
base. But they also built the bridge that still uses the road today, but they built the bridge, and then they tear it down, and then they rebuild it, and it was training to cross the Rhine. So they had races to see who could build the bridge the fastest. And then the airstrip that's there, they rebuilt that every day too. They go out in the morning and lay the airstrip, the metal bars for the runway, and then they tear it out that evening, and then rebuild it the next morning as training.
The last ad I found for Woodford Corn, December 1944. The last one for pumpkin was October 47, and the last ad for Woodford Peas, November 47. So the last ad for any sort of Dickinson product I found was November 47. All three of those ads were from the Chatsworth IGA, which means they had some good stock. They were getting rid of. Okay, so the Dickinson Canning Factory effectively closed after the war. The property stayed with the Libby's people and it was used for storage and stuff, but it effectively closed its usefulness at the end of the war. The north side of the property, in the early 50s, Fauble Concrete started using the north side of the property in the early 1950s. The Morton plant eventually absorbed all of the Washington and the Eureka business, which still does today. Well, that basically ended the Eureka Pumpkin Festival, which some of you may have gone to the Eureka Pumpkin Festival. There's a float that says Congerville School, and it became the Morton Pumpkin Festival, which I'm sure some of you have been to. Personally, this is a clip from a Super 8 film from the Eureka Parade. I don't really even know what relative that was, but it's a little Volkswagen van from the Eureka Pumpkin Festival. And there's my son in the Morton Pumpkin Festival. So I have a personal attachment to both of them. So the canning factory, like I said, it remained functional after the war, mostly for storage for the Libby's company until around 1961. And at that point, a group of Washington civic leaders purchased the building and then sold it to the Champion furnace pipe company. And that business went on for a couple of years. And then in May of 1964, they had a huge fire. Most of the original cannery was lost in that fire. Champion decided not to rebuild, and so a new company came in called American Allied Railway Equipment. And so they came in 1964, and they started building some new buildings and stuff, and they stayed there for, they're really still there, but they changed their name in 2007 to Greenbrier Railway Services. So here's a few pictures I found. I really don't know the years of these. There's no boards on the windows here, so that looks pretty early. This one looks pretty early as well. This one's in color and it's got the board, so this is probably, I don't know, a little bit later. Here's another picture a little bit later. The railway company had another fire in 2009 that burned one of their buildings, and that was the first blaze fought by the new fire chief at that time, Mike Vaughn. 2009. Today, there's one building left that looks like the cannery. One brick building, looks like that. Alliance Wheel Services is the name of the company now. I believe that is on the property, and that's the building that's there. I took this picture about 7 years ago, and the property looked like that. But then the company built a new building in 2022, a 28,000 square foot building as the cornerstone of the property. So then I took this picture about, well, I don't know, 2-3 months ago, before the other talk was canceled. So now the property really looks like this. So you can see the old cannery building and the newer building that they've built. Still chugging out rail wheels all over the place. So Reinhold Pavel, he returned to Germany and lived out his life running a bookstore. He did return to Washington in 1979 to show his family where he had been. He passed away June 4th, 2008 at the age of 92. And then Kentucky Field Pumpkins, which I talked about with Elijah, they also have another name called Dickinson Pumpkins. Nationwide, they're known as Dickinson Pumpkins. They're grown on about 4,000 acres around Tazewell County and 4 adjacent counties, with operations headquartered in Morton. And Libby's owns almost 90% of the North American market for canned pumpkins, and 3/4 of their production comes from this area. In 2015, the Historical Society was able to secure a little over 100 bricks from the original cannery to sell, and we have some of these. How much are they?
$50.
$50. If you want one of those, it looks like that. We do have a few of those. They are original bricks from the cannery. That's all I got. Any questions on that?
Most of my childhood was, well, I was raised at 302 South Market, just 1 block away. And my parents finished that house in 1954, the year I was born. So, we used to go down and actually play on the tracks, play the creek, after, 10 years old. Well, anyway, we used to play in those buildings when they were vacant. When doors were open, windows were open, and very interesting. And I do remember the fire in 1964, you could feel the heat from my back
Oh,
porch. And school was the next day. I remember riding my bike up to the corner of Holland and Market, and, oh, I gotta go down and see what's left of the building. So it was still, keep it down. But, all the kids in that area used to play in the creek behind there, and, you know, that was, I hate to say it, but it is our playground.
Sure.
Yeah. So, a lot of fun memories.
Yes,
Several of those prisoners came back and visited American Allied Railway, and I believe it was the early 90s. And they took a tour of the whole place, and I don't know if it was ever documented. If it was, that was probably lost in the fire.
I think there was an article, I don't know if it was documented in the business, but I think there was an article in the paper, they must have got in touch with a reporter or something. And maybe Mary contacted them and got in touch with them a little bit, because she's got some pictures from one of the prisoners, or maybe it was one of the prisoners that had stayed in contact with, was it the Ackermans? That they had stayed in contact with, so it was good that they came back.
Yeah.
Yes?
The remaining building, I mean, there are a lot of places that have historical significance and they are guarded.
Mhm.
Is this area guarded? Could someone just walk there and see?
Well, it's
if
the, there's a fence around the railway business, I believe. And, so I don't think you can just walk in. So I don't think it's guarded as a historical artifact or anything like that. I think they use it probably for something.
It's a maintenance building.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
This is not about the Washington Canning Factory, but if anybody's interested in this kind of story, there's a book called Playing with the Enemy by Gary Moore. And the author found out about his father's military service, and that was to teach the German POWs in Southern Illinois how to play baseball. Because they had to keep them occupied, they had to give them something to do, and they didn't have a canning factory. So his job was to teach the enemy to play baseball. And I found that a very interesting book, if anybody else would look at it.
Any idea about how many POWs might have been in the Washington Cannery at its peak?
I would say, 200.
200?
I was confused about the creek, John. You first brought it up and then it came back later and the downstream folks were unhappy. What were they putting in the creek? Was it like
They were
pumpkin guts? or
flooding
like-
the floors and they were rinsing the product.
And then that would go into the
And
creek.
that would go in the creek. Anything that was rinsed off the corn coming in or whatever was going in the creek. So all that organic matter.
So when you get a good wind from the south of town here,
Yeah.
you smell that coming off the living room, seepage field up there,
Yeah.
that's what it was smelling like.
Oh.
I mean, it's permanent.
Apparently they fixed it.
Did they fix it?
Yes.
I'm one of the retired teachers that does time travels and trunks in the schools, and the kids really find it interesting that, they took the POWs out to the farms and, they planted the crops, and then it was up to the wives and maybe the neighborhood wives to set out, just kind of like a thrasher's table, so, but they were supposed to stay outside, they were not supposed to go in the homes. And a number of the families in the area were German, in fact, had German background, so it was quite a bit of being able to talk to them.
Yeah. They were probably more friendly with the prisoners than they were supposed to be.
Exactly.
I had to, out of curiosity, had to look up what Teutons were.
Teutons, just Germans.
Germans. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I never heard of it.
That's what Washington people are.
You mentioned Camp Elliott. Two other little tidbits about Camp Ellis I always thought was interesting. Because we are attached to it, this was a Camp Ellis. Camp Ellis had the most advanced hospital in the United States, built there just for military training. The first brain surgery in the United States took place at Camp Ellis, which is amazing when you realize just how short that facility was.
2 years.
Yeah, the other one was, we all remember the TV show MASH? MASH got its start at Camp Ellis, but then that airstrip they built every day, that was so the doctors could take off on a cargo plane, land, set up a field hospital and run a field hospital, and then they board the plane, take it down board, and fly around and land again, but that was the first mobile, quote-unquote, MASH units, were all established at Camp Ellis, and that's where they did all the training. So it is amazing just how, when you go there, how much property they have. You mentioned it looked like, it does. They took over the town, they took over everything, but it's, 70, 80,000 people where there was nothing, and there's nothing now.
All right, well, thanks for coming, everybody, I appreciate it.